Welcome to Formulaic Utopia. My name is Sarah, and today we are going to be exploring the question, what are the best strategies to use to win Monopoly? Yes, that's right, I said it. Today we are going to be exploring the old classic Monopoly board game, and we're going to be asking ourselves, what are the best strategies to use to win it? So let's jump in. So now that we've found the probabilities associated with landing on each space within the game, let's talk about how those probabilities can help us in finding the expected returns for each property within the game and each property set. So an expected return is the amount of revenue a player can expect to receive on any given player's turn. So this is the summation of x times p of x, where x represents the revenue generated by another player landing on any given property, and p of x represents the probability of landing on the property x. So whenever somebody else is up to take a turn, this is going to tell you in general what can you expect to receive out of your property. Okay, so let's look at the expected returns of each property now, where we have either no houses, one house, two houses, three houses, four houses, or a hotel on there. Okay, we're going to look at what are the best three properties and what are the worst three properties given these conditions. Okay, so with no houses on there, the highest expected returns would come from Boardwalk, Park Place, and Pennsylvania Avenue. The lowest expected returns would come from Mediterranean Avenue, Baltic Avenue, and Oriental Avenue. Well, what if we had one house on there? Well, with one house, we can see one house on there that Boardwalk, Pennsylvania Avenue, and Park Place are going to be the three best you could purchase. The worst three with one house would be Mediterranean, Baltic Avenue, and Oriental Avenue. With two houses on there, we would have Boardwalk, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina Avenue as the best three. The worst three would be Mediterranean Avenue, Baltic Avenue, and Oriental Avenue, with three houses on there. We can see that the best three would be Boardwalk, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina Avenue. The worst three would be Mediterranean Avenue, Baltic Avenue, and Oriental Avenue. Maybe we're starting to see somewhat of a trend here. Let's go ahead and move on to four houses, see what happens there. With four houses on, the best three properties are going to be Boardwalk, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina Avenue. The worst three are Mediterranean, Baltic, and Oriental Avenue again. And what about with a hotel on there? Let's look. With a hotel on there, we can see now with a hotel, the best three are actually going to be Boardwalk, Pennsylvania Avenue, and Illinois Avenue. Illinois Avenue had been marking its way up there. It was fourth place and when we were at four houses. Now it's at third place when we have a hotel. Okay, the worst three are still Mediterranean, Baltic, and Oriental Avenue, according to expected returns. Next, let's look at the expected returns associated with each property set. That's probably most important because we actually, the only time we're ever going to really be associated with the expected return of an individual property is when we don't have any houses on there. But once we start putting houses on there, we really have to consider them more as a set than as an individual. So let's go ahead and do that again, but let's do it now for a property set. So if we had no houses on there, the best three would be the green, blue, and yellow property sets. The worst three would be the purple, light blue, and magenta property sets. If we had one house on there, the best three property sets are the green, yellow, and dark blue. The worst three are the purple, light blue, and magenta. If we have two houses on, the best property sets are, once again, the green, yellow, and dark blue. The worst are purple, light blue, and magenta. With three houses, now we have the best three sets are the green, yellow, and red with three houses. And the worst three are still the purple, light blue, and magenta. What about with four houses? So with four houses on there, we have the green, yellow, and red as the best. Worst are the purple, light blue, and magenta. And finally, with a hotel on there, the best three sets are going to be the green, red, and yellow. And the worst three are going to be the purple, light blue, and magenta. This one I think is actually really interesting because the dark blue actually started out in the top property sets according to expected returns when we didn't have any houses on it, or we only had one or two. As soon as we switched the three houses, though, it was no longer in the top place, in the top sets. And by the time we get up to four houses or even a hotel, the dark blue ends up becoming kind of one of the worst property sets to have according to expected returns. So if you own these, keep this in mind. So now that we've looked at expected returns and we've looked at the revenue that we can get from a particular property, we also want to think about what's the cost associated with owning that property. So we're going to look at break-even turns to do that, where this is the number of times another player would have to land on a given property in order to pay it off. And this is essentially the cost of your property divided by the rent on your property. So now let's talk about break-even properties. Let's talk about how many turns does it take to actually pay off your property set. Okay, so here we're looking for the properties with the least amount of turns. So first we're going to look at no houses. So with no houses on, this has been sorted from smallest to largest. So the best three properties to own, according to break even, with no houses, would be Boardwalk, Park Place, not surprisingly, and actually Illinois Avenue, which might be a little surprising to some of us. The worst three, the ones that are going to take the longest to pay themselves off, are going to be Mediterranean Avenue, Vermont Avenue, and Oriental Avenue. Now, this is kind of crazy. Mediterranean without any houses is going to take 30 turns to pay off, where Boardwalk is only going to take 8. So keep this in mind. Of course, Boardwalk is a much more expensive property, but that's interesting. Okay, so with one house on, you want to sort that from smallest to largest. With one house on, the best three properties are Boardwalk, Park Place, Illinois. The worst are going to be Baltic, Mediterranean, and Vermont. With two houses on there, the best three, once again, are going to be Boardwalk, Park Place, and Illinois. The worst three are Vermont now, Baltic, and Mediterranean, and with three houses. Three houses. We're going to have Boardwalk, Park Place, in Illinois, and the worst three are going to be Mediterranean, Baltic, and Vermont still, with 4 houses on there. We have the same thing again. We have Boardwalk, Park Place, Illinois, and the worst 3 are still Vermont, Baltic, and Mediterranean. And if we were to sort the hotels again, we can see, let's do that with the hotels. Smallest to largest. We can see that the best 3 are going to be Boardwalk, Park Place, and Illinois, and that the worst 3 are now actually going to be Mediterranean, North Carolina, and Pacific Avenue. So if you want to put hotels on, be wary how long it might take to pay it off if you have Mediterranean, North Carolina, or Pacific Avenue. Let's look at break-even sets. Once again, if we want to put a house on there or anything else, we really need to probably consider break-even more from a property set perspective than we do an individual property perspective. So let's look at no houses. So let's sort this from smallest to largest. Okay, the best properties to own that are going to pay themselves off the quickest are going to be the blues, the yellows, and the greens. The ones that are going to take the longest are going to be the light blues, the purples, and magenta. Let's look at one house. Interestingly enough, the light blues take more time than the purples, probably because there are 2 of them instead of 3. Now let's look at one house. So for one house, Park Place and Boardwalk, the dark blue sets are going to be the best, followed by the yellows and the greens. The worst 3 now are going to be the purples, light blue, and magenta, with 2 houses on there. We can see that the best sets are going to be still dark blue, yellow, and green, and the worst 3 are going to be the purple, blue, and magenta. What about with 3 houses on there? So with 3 houses on there, once again, we still find the same thing. Dark blues, yellows, and greens are the best, and the purple, light blue, and magenta are the worst. And now let's look at 4 houses. 4 houses on there. We still find the same thing. We find that with 4 houses on there, the best are dark blues, yellows, greens, and the worst are the purple, light blue, and magenta. And finally, with the hotel, let's see what happens there. With the hotel, we find that the best 3 now are actually going to be the dark blues, the yellows, and the oranges. And what happened is down here at the bottom, now the worst 3 are actually the greens, purple, and light blues. So by putting 1 additional unit on there, from going from 4 houses to a hotel, the greens became much harder to pay off. So this is really something to keep in mind with the green properties. Finally, we have the law of diminishing marginal utility, where marginal utility is the additional satisfaction or revenue gained by purchasing an additional house or hotel on a given property. Then, the law of diminishing marginal utility states that as a player increases consumption, there is a decline in the marginal utility that player derives from consuming each additional house or hotel. Okay, so essentially what the law of diminishing marginal utility is now going to help us determine is what is the right amount of houses to put on your property. Okay, so now we have the law of diminishing marginal utility on individual properties. And what we can see happening here is that we hit this wall of diminishing marginal utility right after we get to 3 houses. Okay, so notice we go from a very small expected return in the like $1 range to cent range to once we're up to 1 house, we're kind of in the couple of dollar range. Once we're at 2, most of our properties are in about the tens of dollars, you know, somewhere between $10 and $15 for an expected return. And then we have this serious jump, this huge jump from that to basically 20s and 30s of an expected return. So we practically double or more than double in some of our cases our expected return from 2 to 3 houses. And then what immediately happens after that is, you know, here, this one, this very top line is representing Boardwalk. And so I'm just going to use that. What happens with Boardwalk's expected returns is we go from $35.84 all the way up to $43.53. So that jump isn't as large. Yes, you're still increasing your expected return. You're making more, and that's wonderful, but you're not going to be making as much more as you did, for instance, gaining between 0 and 3 houses as you do between 3 and 5, you know, where 5 is essentially representing your hotel. So what this is showing us is that on individual properties, the best place to stop buying is actually at 3 houses. Now, let's look at that also from a property set perspective. So with property sets, we find kind of a similar thing happening. We find that there's kind of a small increase that happens from 0 to 1 house. From 1 house to 2 houses, there's you know, a fairly significant increase. And then from 2 houses to 3 houses, we just skyrocket. And the additional amount of an expected return that we get out of that. And then once we go from 3 houses to 4 houses, you know, we kind of start leveling off. And yeah, I mean, it's still good, it's still more money, but it's not as much money, you know, it's not as sharp of an increase as it was between 2 and 3. And so once again, we have that same thing happening if we look at it from the set perspective as well. So what this is really showing us is that 3 houses is the best place to stop buying. When we're thinking about our properties, what are going to be the best 3 individual properties that you can buy? So the best 3 individual properties are going to most likely be Illinois Avenue, New York Avenue, and Tennessee Avenue. Why do I say that? The reason for that is those properties are highly, highly likely to be landed upon, and they also get a good amount of expected returns out of 3 houses, and their break-even number of turns to make your money back out of that isn't very much once you have 3 houses out of it. Once you have 3 houses, you only have to have that property landed on once to pay for it, to pay for property and all of the houses on it. So that's pretty neat, right? Now, the worst 3 properties, individual properties, in my opinion, are going to be Mediterranean, Park Place, and Baltic Avenue. Now, Mediterranean, Park Place, and Baltic have the lowest probabilities of being landed upon, and they also have some of the lower expected returns. Now, Park Place is an exception, of course, but while Park Place has a really high expected return and, you know, a low number of turns needed to pay it off, it's one of the least likely properties to be landed upon. So you're going to spend a lot of money investing in it, and it may not really ever get landed upon. So that's something to keep in mind when you're playing and when you're buying the dark blue sets. Now, speaking of sets, let's look at wrapping up our sets. Okay, so What are the best three sets, in my opinion, overall, according to the math? I think that the best three sets are going to be the Reds, Kentucky, Indiana, and Illinois Avenue, the Oranges, St. James Place, Tennessee, and New York Avenue, and the Yellows, Atlantic, Ventnor, and Marvin Gardens. And then the worst three property sets to own would be the purples, dark blue, and light blues. So the reason I say that is because they are not as likely to be landed upon in the purples case. It's not likely to be landed upon. You're not going to get much out of your expected return, and it's going to take a lot of turns to pay it off. For Park Place, yes, you have a high level of expected return. It's not going to take very long to pay it off. It's going to be one of the shortest payoffs, but it's not going to be very likely to be landed upon. You're going to be betting on Boardwalk being landed upon to pay for everything. Not a great position. So, if I was you, I would go with the Reds and the Oranges.
Thanks for watching.